Outlaws mock a silent cowgirl, only to realize she's the fastest draw in the West. Would you look at that, girls carrying irons. She don't talk. Probably scared she sounds like her daddy's stable hand. They say she's fast, but I've yet to see that hand twitch. All hat, no fire. Laughter cracked through the midday heat, rough and mean. 4 cowboys stood outside the saloon in Dry Hollow's sun-bleached square, drunk on whiskey in their own boredom. They leaned against hitching posts, sweat bleeding through their shirts, spurs clinking every time one shifted his stance. The kind of men who talked big because their bullets hadn't been tested lately. One of them, with a twisted grin and a scar slicing through his beard, dropped his boot heel into the dirt and squinted up the road. The others followed his gaze. Down the street, walking through a haze of rising heat, came a figure that silenced even the flies. Isabel Hartley, known across 3 counties as Belle, and in whispers as the Silent One, walked with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what she could do, and had no need to explain it. Her boots left shallow prints in the dust, her coat shifting slightly in the breeze. Her wide-brimmed hat cast a long shadow over a face carved in calm. Sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of storm clouds, and a jaw that had never begged for anything. She wore a faded long coat, edges frayed from years in the saddle, and a pair of well-worn Colts holstered low on her hips. The handles were dulled from use, the leather cracked but maintained. Everything about her said she was ready for whatever the desert had to throw, and she had seen most of it already. The townsfolk knew her. Oh, they didn't speak to her, not much, but they gave her space. Doors opened when she walked by, not out of courtesy but caution. She never picked fights, but somehow they always found her. And when they did, they ended fast. She never said much, and she never missed. The cowboy straightened, curiosity sharpening into mockery. The one with the scar stepped forward, cocky in that way fools often are. "Well now," he said, flicking the stub of his cigar toward her boots. "What's a woman like you doing with iron on both hips? Gonna shoot holes in your own skirt?" Belle didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her pace didn't change. She walked right past him like he wasn't worth the dust on her boots. He scowled, turned with a sneer. "Hey now, too good to talk to a man. Or just scared you'll prove us right?" Another chimed in, voice loud, hoping to bait her. "Simon, sweetheart, let's see if you're as fast as the ghost stories say. Unless you're just another legend made out to wind." Belle stopped. The air shifted, a ripple in the heat. She turned, slow, like she was giving the wind time to carry away regrets. Her coat parted just enough to show the glint of her gumboot. She didn't reach. She didn't speak. She just looked. And suddenly the sun wasn't the hottest thing in Dry Hollow. The scarred cowboy cracked his knuckles, stepping into the center of the street. "All right then, noon showdown, you and me. Let's give the folks something to talk about." No one moved. Someone inside the saloon yanked the curtain down. A dog whimpered under a wagon. An old man leaned back in his chair and whispered, "Lord help him." The cowboy's hand twitched. Belle's moved first. Bang! His gun never cleared the leather. He jerked backward, eyes wide, dead before the dust caught his fall. Bang! A second man dropped, arms flailing, blood already soaking into the dry street. Gasps rose from the porches. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Belle stood alone, Colt still smoking, not a flicker of emotion on her face. She holstered her weapon with the grace of someone who had done it too many times to count. She turned to leave. But the last 2 men weren't done. Rage twisted their faces. One shouted, drawing. The other fumbled with his holster, hands shaking with fury. Belle didn't wait. She sprinted toward the edge of town where her horse, Shadow, stood tied beneath the dead oak. Gunfire ripped through the square as she vaulted into the saddle. Her boots hit the stirrups just as Shadow surged forward. Bullets sliced the air behind her. She didn't look back. By the time the last echo faded and the dust settled, Belle was already a streak against the horizon, racing into the open desert. Dry Hollow stood still, the townsfolk staring after her, breathless. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The legend had grown. The desert wind cut across the plain, dry and sharp, lifting the dust like smoke from a dying fire. Belle urged Shadow faster, her breath tight in her throat, the roar of hooves behind her like thunder rolling over cracked earth. The remaining 2 outlaws were not letting her go easy. She had taken down their friends. Now they wanted her blood. The open land stretched ahead, no trees, no shelter, only brittle scrub and stone. Shadow's muscles rippled beneath her, but even he could not outrun bullets forever. A shot cracked behind her. Dirt exploded near her stirrup. Another rider gained ground, closing in fast. One of them reached out, gripping the leather of her reins. Belle twisted hard, trying to pull free, but his pistol was already rising, aimed at her back. Then, boom! The outlaw's body jerked sideways, a spray of blood misting the air. He tumbled from the saddle, landing hard in the dust. His horse veered off with a wild scream. Belle turned sharply, eyes darting. A lone figure rode in from the north ridge, rifle smoking, eyes locked on her. He rode bareback, hat low, coat flapping behind him. It was Matteo Salinas. Quiet, steady. The boy she once called coward. The boy who never carried a gun. He did now. Before the second outlaw could react, Matteo fired again. Another clean shot that clipped the man's shoulder, spinning him from his horse. The second man groaned but did not rise. Belle stared, stunned. Matteo brought his horse to a skidding stop beside her. Dust curled around them like smoke. His chest heaved. His eyes were wide but focused. "Come on," he barked. "We've got to move." Before she could respond, he reached out, grabbed her hand, and yanked. They rode together, side by side, his hand gripping hers so tightly she could feel his heartbeat in his palm. Another bullet hissed past, close enough to lift the hem of her coat. Still, Belle did not think of death. She only thought, he came. They rode hard into the rocks where the plain gave way to rough cliffs and narrow gulches. Matteo knew the land, had spent his childhood mapping every ridge, every cave. He led her into a crevice half hidden behind thornbrush and dry stone, where the air was cooler and the shadows deep. They slid from their horses, leading them into the dark. Only when they had climbed behind the rock wall did they finally stop. Belle dropped to the ground, back against the stone, chest rising like a bellows. Matteo collapsed beside her. Silence. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. A small sound at first, then full-bodied, bright and reckless. It spilled out of her like water from a cracked jug. Matteo turned, eyes wide, and then he laughed too. It was a wild, breathless sound. The kind only children made when they survived something they never expected to. They looked at each other, faces streaked with dust and sweat, and something like disbelief. For a moment they were not the fastest draw or the quiet blacksmith's son. They were just Belle and Matteo again. Two kids hiding behind the water tower. Two hearts beating louder than gunfire. And for once, the silence between them did not feel like something broken. It felt like something whole. By the time the sun rose 2 days after the firefight, Dry Hollow had gone back to its usual rhythm. Quiet streets, creaky porches, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. But something between Isabella and Matteo had shifted. They had survived together. Now they moved apart. Matteo returned to his forge only once before packing up his tools and disappearing from town for days. Isabella didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She hadn't seen him since they'd laughed breathless in the cave, hearts pounding in the dust. Instead, she went back to the stables, where she watered horses and mended tack for old cowhands who never looked her in the eye. In the afternoons, she trained young ranch kids how to hold a pistol, how to breathe before they pulled the trigger. They all feared her a little and respected her a lot. But she wasn't really there. She kept glancing at the forge, expecting to see him sweating over steel. He never was. The quiet ate at her more than the gunfire ever had. Long before bullets and bounty hunters, they had been just two kids from nowhere. Matteo had grown up the son of a preacher who'd lost his faith and opened a tiny library no one ever visited. Scrawny, soft-voiced, he couldn't throw a rope or hit a target if his life depended on it. The other boys mocked him every day after church, called him girl-boned and book boy. They shoved him in the dirt, stole his lunch, snapped his pencils in two. Isabella saw it all. She was the daughter of a Mexican horse trainer who worked the Hartley Ranch until he died under a wagon. Her mother cleaned floors, patched pants, and died young of fever. By the time Isabella was 10, she could shoot straighter than the ranch hands and skin a rattlesnake without blinking. The first time she saw a boy throw a rock at Matteo, she hit him between the eyes with a marble from her slingshot. The next day, she stood over Matteo while he sat bleeding on the schoolhouse steps and told the others flatly, "You don't touch him unless you want to lose that hand." No one ever did again. After that, they were always together, quiet and strange. She would toss apples at his window. He would sneak her books from his father's shelves, dime novels, Latin dictionaries, war journals. She couldn't sit still long enough to finish most of them, but she liked the sound of his voice when he read aloud. They fetched water, fixed fences, raced horses down dry creek beds, sat beside each other on fence rails and said nothing for hours. It was a silence that meant something. In a town where words were cheap and bullets cheaper, Theirs was a bond no one understood, and neither of them dared name. Back in the present, Isabella hadn't seen him in 5 days. She asked around but got shrugs and guesses. Someone said he was out near the Mesa. Someone else said they saw him riding toward the old Hartley place, where his father used to sit and read when the world was too loud. That was where she went. It was almost sundown when she rode into the gulch behind the ruins of the Hartley barn. The boards were warped and gray, but the old corral still stood. She remembered Mateo fixing its gate with trembling hands and a bent nail. There on the fence rail he sat, shoulders hunched, hat low, a letter open in his lap. His fingers trembled as he traced the ink. She didn't call his name. She just tied her horse to the rail, climbed up beside him, and sat. The silence between them stretched wide. He didn't look up, but he slid something from his coat pocket and held it out. A torn piece of cloth, pale blue, frayed at the edge, the same one he used to wrap her scraped knee when they were 12. She took it. She didn't cry often. But the tears came then, slow, hot, silent. They left clean lines down her dust-covered cheeks. He said, softly, "You used to fight for me." Her voice broke for the first time in days. "I still do." The late afternoon sun stretched gold across the open prairie, bathing the grasslands in a quiet kind of peace only the west could offer. Cicadas hummed in the distance. A hawk wheeled overhead. The air was warm but soft, and everything smelled faintly of wild sage and dust. Isabella leaned back against a wooden fence post, arms folded across her chest. Her horse grazed lazily a few yards off, reins dragging the ground. She stared out at nothing in particular, just the tall grass rippling like waves under the breeze. Mateo stood beside her. They had not spoken much since that day at the corral, when she found him with the letter, and he gave her that scrap of cloth. But they kept ending up in the same places, silent together, orbiting like stars that didn't dare collide. Today had been no different. She had shown up at the Westfield to check a broken gate. He was already there, hammer in hand. They worked side by side in silence for an hour, until the gate finally held and the nails stopped shaking. Now, they just stood. Mateo stared at the horizon, then at the toes of his boots. He cleared his throat once. Then again. "I never knew how to say it," he said finally, voice low. "But I reckon I've loved you since before I could shoot straight." Isabella blinked. Her heart did not skip, it stumbled. The breeze seemed to die for a moment. He did not look at her. He just kept talking, slowly, like he was peeling off a skin he'd worn too long. "I figured it would pass," he said. "Thought maybe it was just because you were always there, always braver than I was. Smarter. Louder without ever saying a damn word." He smiled, but it was a sad thing, tugged thin and quiet. "But it didn't pass. Not when you bloodied that boy's nose for me. Not when you rode 3 miles in the rain just to get my fool arm stitched. And not after that cave. Not after hearing you laugh like the world finally gave you permission." He paused. The words hung between them, heavy as lead. Isabella didn't answer. She didn't move. She just stared at the sun sinking behind the hills, eyes suddenly burning. Her fingers twitched at her side. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her throat tightened like a noose. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward her horse. Mateo's breath caught, but he didn't chase her. He didn't call out. He knew better. He just stood there, hands still resting on the fence rail, as she mounted and rode away without looking back. The wind picked up again as her silhouette grew smaller and smaller on the ridge. By the time she disappeared behind the hills, the prairie was empty except for one man and a broken gate. And Mateo's heart, still hanging on a sentence that had finally found its voice, only to be met with silence. The silence after Mateo's confession was louder than any gunshot. It echoed through the days, settled in the corners of Dry Hollow like desert dust. Every street she walked, every barn she passed, seemed to hold its breath with her. Days passed, then a week. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them dared. Dry Hollow went on like it always did. Horses still needed shoeing. Saddles still needed oiling. The church bell still rang on Sundays, even though no one listened. But something in the air had changed. It was like the whole town had inhaled in surprise and forgot how to exhale. Even the wind seemed quieter. The laughter outside the saloon had lost its sting. The forge went cold. Isabella didn't go near the blacksmith's. She avoided the watering trough by the chapel where he often passed through at dusk. She no longer visited the cafe where they once shared quiet mornings over tin mugs of bitter coffee and thick biscuits that crumbled like dry earth. She kept to the stables, oiling tack, brushing manes, keeping her head down and her hands busy. But when the sun dipped behind the red rock ridge and the town was no longer watching, she rode. She saddled Shadow without a word, tied her bedroll tight behind the saddle, and galloped into the woods where the pines grew thick, the moonlight dim, and the world didn't expect anything from her. There, in a hollow between two ridges, she had found an old fence line, half-rotted and abandoned. She turned it into a firing range. She lined tin cans on posts and stumps, spacing them unevenly like crooked teeth grinning in the dark. Then she drew. Bang, clink, reload. Bang, bang, bang. Each shot hit. Each one came quicker than the last. But the rhythm didn't calm her. The accuracy didn't satisfy her. The ache in her chest burned deeper with every pull of the trigger. Because the shots weren't for practice. They were punishment. For the things she should have said. For the look in his eyes after her silence. For the kindness he had always given so freely, and the wall she had always kept between them. She had tried to explain, once. Had sat at the edge of her bed with a pencil and a scrap of paper that still smelled faintly of gun oil and cedar. She wrote, "I'm sorry. You surprised me. I've never been good with feelings, but I never stopped fighting for you." Then she read it. Once, twice. And she lit it on fire. She watched it curl black, flake away, and disappear before her feet. She thought it might make her feel lighter. Instead, it made her feel like stone. So she kept writing. She kept firing. Until her hands ached, her ears rang, and her breath came ragged in the night air. She missed not the targets, but the sound of his voice reading to her by lantern light. The way his hands had once brushed hers when they both reached for the same bridle. The steadiness in his eyes when the world got too loud. The way he looked at her like she wasn't made of grit and scars but something rare. Something worth keeping. Isabella lowered her Colt. The last of the smoke drifted up into the pines, disappearing between the branches like a prayer that hadn't found a sky to land in. She holstered the weapon, kicked over the stump where the cans used to sit, and let the silence swallow her whole. The sky over Dry Hollow was bruised with storm clouds, but the rain never came. Dust clung to the air like breath held too long. The town square, usually half empty this time of day, was crowded. Word had spread like wildfire they were back. The same men Isabella had faced weeks ago. Fewer now but meaner. They'd buried their dead, and come back with a hunger not even the desert could dry up. They rode in slow, boots scraping gravel, spurs chiming like death bells, guns on their hips, hate in their eyes. They stopped outside the saloon and dismounted like kings claiming a broken throne. "She around?" one of them asked, loud enough for every ear in town. "That silent girl with the fast hands?" No one answered. "She's probably off kissing her lapdog," another one sneered. "What's his name again? That blacksmith boy? The girl's dog?" The laughter was loud, ugly. Isabella heard it from the feed store. She froze mid-step. The bag of oats slipped from her hand, spilling across the floor like silver dust. Her jaw clenched. Her breath slowed.
She turned and walked out.
The townsfolk parted as she stepped into the square, her boots striking the ground like the ticking of a clock. The men turned. Well, one drawled, smiling like a snake. "She speaks with her feet, at least." Isabella stopped in the center of the street. The wind tugged her coat open, revealing both Colts at her hips. "You talk too much," she said, voice flat as desert rock. The man's smile faded. "Careful now. We came looking for a fight." "I know." She undid the loop on her holster. The street went silent. No one moved. One of the outlaws chuckled nervously. "You think you can take all of us?" Isabella's eyes didn't leave the leader's face. No. She didn't need to. Because footsteps echoed behind her. Mateo stepped into view. He walked slowly, sleeves rolled, no jacket, no hat. Just his hammer hanging on one hip and a borrowed Colt on the other. He moved to her side like it was where he had always belonged. "I'm here," he said softly. She didn't look at him, but something in her shoulders relaxed. "You shouldn't be," she muttered. "I know," he replied. "But I am." Across the square, the men laughed again, but the sound lacked bite. The leader barked, "You both draw, you both die. You want to defend a woman, dog? Then bleed with her." Mateo didn't flinch. "I'd rather die beside her than live with your kind." The leader spit, "Your funeral." Then everything happened at once. The sun broke through the clouds, a single beam striking Isabella's gun like a flare. She moved. So did they. Gunfire cracked like lightning. Isabella's Colts blazed, each shot precise, each movement fluid. She danced between bullets like wind slipping through wire. Mateo stood firm, steady as an oak, his hands not as fast but sure. He took aim, fired once, hit. Then again, hit. A body fell. Another stumbled. Screams, hooves, dust flying. Isabella dropped her final man with a clean shot through the chest, spun and found Matteo still standing. Blood on his sleeve, but not his. The silence afterward was deeper than any church. 4 men lay in the dirt. The rest had fled. No one in Dry Hollow moved. Isabella lowered her guns. Matteo wiped his brow, exhaled slow. She turned to him, eyes unreadable. "You could have gotten killed," she said. "So could you," he answered. They stared at each other, breathless, bruised, alive. Someone from the saloon clapped once, then twice. A third followed. Soon the square was full of applause, nervous, stunned, respectful. But Isabella didn't hear it. She only heard the sound of his voice, steady beside her. And for the first time in a long time, the space between them felt like something that belonged. Underscore 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 underscore. The light at sunset in Dry Hollow did strange things to the land. It softened the dust, gilded the rocks, and stretched every shadow longer than it had any right to be. The air turned golden, then bruised at the edges, and the wind died down to a hush, like the whole desert was holding its breath, waiting for something that might never come. By the old dry well at the edge of town, Isabella sat on the stone lip, her boots scuffed, her hat resting in her lap. The well hadn't held water in years, but folks still passed it like it might one day rise again. Like memory could fill what time had hollowed out. She stared at nothing in particular, just the horizon smudged in pink and rust, where the sun bled into the hills. The quiet wasn't new to her, but today it wasn't peace. Today it was unfinished business. Behind her, Matteo stood with his arms crossed, not close enough to cast a shadow over her, not far enough to pretend he had not come looking. He watched the way the light caught in her hair, how her shoulders lifted and fell like waves she'd been riding too long. He didn't speak. He'd learned by now that silence was her language too. She sat there for a long while. Neither of them moved. The wind stirred a tumbleweed across the dirt path, brushing the edge of her boot, then tumbling off again. Finally she looked up at him. Her eyes were rimmed with something not quite sadness, not quite fear either. Maybe it was just tiredness, or maybe it was something she'd never dared show before. "Do you know why I left that day?" she asked, voice low, steady. Matteo shook his head honest. He didn't offer guesses, didn't fill the space with words that might crowd the truth. She turned toward him slowly, setting the hat beside her on the stone, and reached out for his hand. He didn't flinch. He let her take it. "I didn't run from fear," she said. "I ran from everything I felt." Her fingers tightened around his. "I don't know how to carry that. I never had to. It was always fight or ride, shoot or bleed, survive. But when you said what you said, it felt like more than I could hold." Matteo didn't speak right away. He looked at her, really looked, like he'd done 100 times before. When she was bleeding but wouldn't say it. When she was hurting but too proud to limp. When her eyes told more than her mouth ever could. Then he stepped closer. His shadow reached her boots now. He took her other hand, both rough from work, warm from being near her. "Then stop running," he said. Simple. Steady. The way truth always sounded when he spoke it. She closed her eyes. A tear escaped, slid down her cheek, catching the last bit of light before it disappeared into the dust. She didn't wipe it away. She just nodded once, not for him, for herself. She stood. Their hands were still linked. And when she leaned in, he met her halfway. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was quiet, certain. Like exhaling after years of holding her breath. Like coming home to something she didn't realize she'd left behind. Their lips touched, gentle at first, then deeper, like memory finding its place again. It wasn't fire or thunder. It was warmth, a shelter, a promise made without words. When they finally parted, Isabella rested her forehead against his. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Matteo smiled, small, crooked, but real. "I've been waiting for you to stop running since we were kids," he whispered. Isabella let out a soft chuckle, low and raspy like gravel rolling in her throat. "Guess I finally figured out where to stop." The last light folded around them as the sun slipped behind the ridge. And beside the old well where people once came for water, they found something far more rare. Each other. The ranch sat on the far side of Dry Hollow, just beyond the broken ridge where the grass still grew wild and the wind sang through the cottonwoods like a hymn. It was not much, 2 barns with crook nails, a corral patched with second-hand lumber, and a wide front porch that creaked whenever someone stepped too heavy. But it was theirs. And in a land like this, theirs meant everything. Isabella and Mateo built it with more grit than guidance, more silence than plans. Fence posts hammered in at dusk, saddles mended by lantern light, water drawn from the shallow stream a mile down the trail. They didn't talk much about what they were building, just worked until it stood. Word traveled fast in the territory. The Silent One had hung up her spurs. But they were wrong. She hadn't softened. Not really. She still shot straighter than any man from Fort Halley to Laredo. And once a week, on Wednesdays, just after noon, she'd line up 6 or 7 dusty-faced kids behind the barn and show them how to stand, how to hold, how to aim. She taught them more than shooting. She taught them patience, breathing, respect for the trigger. She didn't talk much. But her hands did. They were sure, gentle, exact. The same hands that once clenched fists now guided little fingers to proper form. And when they missed, she didn't scold, just reloaded the chamber and nodded for them to try again. Mateo kept the forge burning beside the stables, teaching older boys how to shape metal with control instead of fury. Steel remembers, he'd say, tapping the anvil, so don't teach it anger. Together they made something quiet and good, not perfect, not peaceful, but strong. One hot afternoon, as the sun crawled lazy across the sky, a stranger rode up the trail. He was lean, dusty, and carried himself like a man who hadn't trusted anyone in years. His horse was tired, his hat low, his boots cracked and sun-worn. He tied the reins slow and looked around. The barn, the corral, the porch. Then he saw her, Isabella, leaning against the porch post, sharpening a blade with long, steady strokes. He stared at her a moment. "Ain't you that silent girl who dropped 5 men in one breath?" he asked, voice low, half cautious, half impressed. She didn't look up. Didn't answer. Mateo stepped out from the side door, wiping grease from his fingers on a worn cloth. He glanced at the stranger, then at Isabella. "She don't speak much," he said, but she never needed to. The stranger held his gaze for a long moment. Then he tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode off into the dusk without another word. That night the porch creaked under the weight of 2 bodies and the comfort of silence. Mateo and Isabella sat side by side, watching the horses move slow and easy in the fading light. The sky was bleeding gold into purple, stars just starting to wake. Crickets sang. Somewhere, a coyote called low in the hills. Mateo reached over and took her hand, the calluses on his fingers catching hers just slightly. "You know," he said, almost smiling, "they still don't understand you." She turned to him, just enough to raise one brow. He chuckled. "But I do." She didn't speak, just leaned her shoulder into his, steady and warm. And in that hush, the hush they had both fought hard to earn, they sat together, not needing anything but what they'd already found. She never needed words to be feared. But he was the only one who ever listened enough to love her right. Thank you for riding with us through the dust, the danger, and the quiet strength of the Silent One. If her story moved you the way her silence spoke louder than gunfire, the way love found her not in words but in action, then you're exactly where you belong. At Wild West Love Stories, we bring you powerful tales of outlaws, cowgirls, and quiet heroes, stories of love born in gun smoke and grit, where the heart speaks even when the mouth stays shut. If you want more unforgettable journeys like this one, make sure to subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next story from the frontier. Because here, love ain't always loud, but it sure knows how to shoot straight. See you on the next ride.